minutes and then we get it. Okay, thank you. Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Soy Julia Palacios, académica del Departamento de Comunicación. Me da mucho gusto recibirles en esta tercera jornada de la celebración de nuestros 25 años de la Cátedra UNESCO en Comunicación y Sociedad, que está hospedada en el Departamento de Comunicación de la Universidad Iberoamericana. Welcome, everyone. I am very glad to receive you here, to welcome you here. I am Julia Palacios, academic of the Communications Department at the Universidad Iberoamericana, and I am very happy to receive you here in this third session of our conferences celebrating the 25 years of our UNESCO Chair in Communication and Society that is located at the Communications Department at Universidad Iberoamericana. And I want to greet Professor Manuel Alejandro Guerrero, who is the chair of our department and chair of the UNESCO chair, too many chairs, in Communication and Society of UNESCO. So, Dr. Guerrero, please. Your microphone.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I just want to thank Professor Anya Schiffrin, the Director of Technology, Media and Communication at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, to be so generous and kind to give us this lecture this evening. And the topic she's going to talk about is one of the most important nowadays, because it deals with platforms, it deals with regulation, it deals with rights to information, and well, the future of information, basically. So I won't delay you more with my words, so I give back the word to Dr. Julia Palacios. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guerrero. And well, to start with this, I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Maira Vaca. She's also a faculty member of our communications department, and she will be presenting Professor Schiffrin with this very, very exciting subject that we have for you today. Thank you very much again for your presence. And Dr. Vaca, please.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to present Professor Anya Schiffrin to our audience, for those who don't know her, which I find it very difficult. Professor Schiffrin is the Director of Technology, Media and Communications at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, CIPA. She has worked extensively on journalism, development, and investigative reporting in the Global South. Clearly, her, and I should say impressive, list of publications reflects this commitment. Over the last decade, for instance, she has focused on media in Africa. One specific example of this effort is her edition published a couple of years ago, named Africa Muckraking 70 Years in Investigative Journalism from Africa, that developed from an earlier historic global work and journalism, 100 years of investigative reporting from around the world. Early this year, she published her book, Media Capture: How Money, Digital Platforms, and Governments Control the News. Naturally, this line of research matches up with the work we've done inside our Department of Communications at Universidad Iberoamericana that tries to explore an Asian puzzle, why the media are as they are, but trying to elaborate on new answers and questions looking beyond the traditional Western point of view. Today, as Dr. Manuel Alejandro Guerrero was telling us, Professor Anya Schiffrin is going to talk us through a very challenging task, which is how to think of media regulation nationally, transnationally, she's going to tell us, facing these tech giants and platforms that are enormous, not only in economic terms, but also thinking of geography, audiences, contents, and all kinds of resources. Professor Schiffrin, thank you very much for joining us this evening in Spain, this afternoon Mexico City. Welcome.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos. Es un honor estar aquí con ustedes y bueno, felicitaciones y gracias al doctor Guerrero, doctora Palacios y doctora Vaca. Estoy muy contenta de estar con ustedes y lo siento que no estoy realmente con ustedes en México, donde yo tengo mucha familia. He estado un montón de veces. Gracias. Voy a intentar share my screen y hablar con ustedes de mi current trabajo. Great, let me just get into presentation mode here. Thank you. So I'll be talking to you over the next few minutes about the research that we have been doing on regulation and supporting journalism. And this is something that I've been looking at quite a lot in the last 9 months. And I think that the crisis that journalism is in has led to a huge amount of creativity and good ideas for solutions. So I'll begin by saying that my book on media capture is coming out next week. And it's the 3rd volume in a series that Dr. Guerrero actually contributed to. This volume is really looking at the power of big tech and how it controls the media and the effect that that Google and Facebook have really had on journalism in terms of content and also financially. And I think that when we started looking at media capture in 2016, it was really something that economists focused on, but people in the sort of journalism, communication studies weren't really thinking about that much. It felt like a sort of technical economics theory. And I think in a lot of countries, it wasn't really understood how it affected them. So capture is this idea of soft control of the media. The idea is that you have oligarchs, autocrats in power, and then they have their cronies who control different media outlets. And that helps sort of give them a voice, give the government a voice. Probably the simplest definition is Alina Munju Pipidi, when government and media owners are pretty much working together in cahoots. And for years, the countries that were examples of this were places like Turkey, Venezuela under Chavez, Hungary, for example, but now Mexico clearly, but now the problem has really, really spread. So I think that in the journalism community all over the world, there's a lot of worry about soft control of the media. And so that's sort of a backdrop. When we think about regulation, it's important to remember that that's one of the things that people are sort of thinking about right now. The other thing that's happened is that during the COVID pandemic, there are many, many more people consuming news than ever before. And yet financially, the media outlets have not benefited from this. Advertising has fallen in many places. And while audiences have risen dramatically, even doubled, the revenue from audiences has not. So these things, the sort of worry about control, about capture, about the power of tech, and the worry about the business model have galvanized people in the journalism community to start thinking about ways to solve the financial problems facing journalism. So that's really sort of the impetus, I think, from a lot of the people in the journalism community and some of the would-be regulation. Another aspect of all of the talk about regulation right now is the fear of mis and disinformation, which is leading governments to think that they have to do something about the power of big tech. And of course, worries from the competition authorities around the world that are less interested in saving journalism and more just worried about how powerful companies like Google are. So you have a lot of reasons that regulation is sort of coming to the forefront. And so that's one angle I'm going to be talking about tonight. But I'm also going to talk about some of the other ideas for supporting journalism, because they're all kind of related in some ways. So I teach at Columbia, as you mentioned in Dr. Vaca in this very nice introduction. And that means I try not to be too depressing. So instead of, in my courses at Columbia, instead of talking about all the problems facing journalism, I try to make sure that we're always thinking about the solutions. So one of our reports that we issued earlier this year was about all the ideas that came up to help journalism during the COVID pandemic. And one thing we saw was that companies like Google and Facebook started giving much more money to journalism and creating emergency funds. And that was certainly part of their PR because they were afraid of regulation. We saw foundations giving emergency grants. And in many countries, not the US as far as I know, but in places like Canada and Australia, many parts of Europe and Singapore, governments started handing out money to journalists and to help small media outlets as well. There's been a push in some parts of the world of trying to think how we can develop new business models and help traditional media transition to digital. So in the report, we talk a little bit about some proposals in Kenya and Southern Africa. I think in the US at this point, we're just so depressed about business models. We don't believe there will be a new business model. I think Google and Facebook took all the advertising, and it's sort of a fantasy to think that we're going to suddenly discover a solution. And then another idea that's gaining popularity, but is still quite debated, is this whole idea of making the big tech companies pay for news. And this is what Australia has done. And this is one of the big sort of regulations that's really just taken place. It came into effect in February, and Google and Facebook fought it tooth and nail. So I'll be going through some of these with you throughout the next few minutes. I think I've already explained that there's basically turning out to be kind of, several models of support for media. So I'm going to skip this one. We look in the report a little bit about the different foundations and how much money they're giving to journalism. And I think the point of this slide is that even though the foundations in the US and overseas development aid is helping journalism, you can see how little it is. These amounts of money are it's very nice that the foundations are doing that. It's very generous, but it's not actually enough to save journalism financially. So, there's estimates of billions a year are needed. So 100 million or a couple hundred million from a few major foundations, plus all the other aid. It's just not going to do it. There's a big initiative at the moment for $1 billion fund to support journalism in the Global South. And that was really started by several people at BBC Media Action. It's being funded by Luminate Foundation. So it's important for you all to know that this is underway, but it has not yet raised, a major donor. So that's another aspect. And this is an idea that would bring together money from a lot of different governments and donors, and then give it out to media outlets, but also institutions. It could be universities in the Global South. So these are all some of the ideas about saving journalism. And like I said, I think the most major regulatory change that's happened this year is what Australia has tried to do. And that is very interesting because for years, some of the governments in Europe, like Spain and France, tried to get Google to pay copyright for the news that they use, and they absolutely refused. And what Australia did was something different. They said, we're not going to use copyright or intellectual property. We're going to use competition law because there's an unequal balance between the big tech companies and the small media outlets. And we are going to force Google and Facebook to pay for news. And if they cannot agree with the outlets how much they should pay, then they will have to go to arbitration. And it's a special kind of arbitration which Australia is very fond of, which forces people to give their best offer first, so it brings them close together immediately. Now, you would think that the whole world of journalism would be extremely happy about this law, but journalists are never happy. So already there's been quite a lot of controversy because small outlets are worried that in Australia, most of the money would go to Rupert Murdoch. And that's one of the things that we're seeing in several different countries where government is trying to help media through new regulation and new funding, is outlets are complaining. So in Germany, Kraut Reporter, which is a small independent outlet, threatened, I think they wrote a furious letter. I think they even threatened to sue the German government because the German government wanted to start giving money to support media outlets. And they said, it's not fair. You're just giving money to the big ones, not the small ones. So this is also an argument we're seeing in the US now. There's a bunch of different proposals out there. And the large outlets want some kind of proposals and the small outlets want different kinds of laws. So this was a big argument. This has been a very sort of discussed thing, and Google and Facebook threatened to just, cut off. Facebook came out very nasty, said, we're not going to show you any Australian news anymore. We're basically going to kick all the news out of Facebook. But in the end, they had to capitulate. The law passed in Australia. And interestingly, what happened was Google started giving more money to the publishers in France. So they've actually now settled their lawsuit in France. So the Australian lawsuit, the Australian law is having an impact around the world. So that's actually quite significant. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is find out, at Columbia, we've done some webinars about the Australian law, and we wanted to see would other countries copy it. And what was clear was that the UK, Canada, and South Africa are all interested in emulating some parts of the Australian approach. So that's something for you to sort of look out for and see. And what the EU is going to do is they've got the EU copyright directive and a new digital services legislation as well, which I can talk about later. And so the EU countries are not following the Australian model, but they're going to have to implement national legislation under the EU copyright directive. And in the US, we do have a bill that would actually allow the media houses to negotiate with the large tech firms. And if you're interested in following what's going on in the United States, I highly recommend the coverage on the Poynter website, Poynter, because they're covering a lot of this quite closely, actually. So the Australian law was one of the first major laws that's come out this year. And again, there are lots of worries about it. Free Press, for example, is afraid that this really won't help, that, they say connecting an old business media model to disinformation won't foster a better future for journalists. And what they're pushing for is a tax on micro-targeted advertising. And they would like to see that money allocated for funding for a public interest media endowment. Other ideas would be a tax credit for newspaper subscriptions or funding from state governments to support local media. These are all ideas that are going on in the US right now. I think one thing, in the beginning, I was very enthusiastic about this idea of forcing Google and Facebook to pay for news. And now I'm starting to get a little worried because I think what will happen is they're going to give so much money to the media outlets that it may end up exacerbating this problem of capture that we were talking about in the first slide. What we're seeing all over the world is Google and Facebook giving money to many outlets, giving money to academics. And basically, this is all part of their PR strategy. So when they were afraid of regulation in Europe, they started giving more money to journalism organizations in Europe. They fund conferences now. If you go to a conference, you see not just they're pushing their tools and their ideas and their platform, but they're also they're giving a lot of funding, right? They funded the fact-checking movement in many places. So I'm definitely getting a little more worried about direct payments from the tech companies to the media outlets. So I understand that. Other laws that are being proposed in the US right now. So July 2020, but I don't think anything's happening right now. It's in some ways similar to what Canada did, which is a bipartisan bill that proposes a series of credits to support local newspapers. It would provide direct subsidies. This is actually what Sweden does as well. But I don't think, because this bill wasn't reintroduced in 2021, I don't think anything's happening right now. Journalism Competition and Preservation Act is supported by all the big media houses, or not all, but some. And this is similar in a way to the Australia bill, because what it does is it allows the news publishers to work together to establish deals with the digital platforms. And the idea is that they would have a safe harbor. Up until now, you may remember the fight that I think it was Hachette had with Amazon. Publishers were not allowed to get together to bargain against the tech companies because they would be accused of anti-competitive practices. So this bill would give them an exemption in order to do that kind of bargaining. So the News Media Alliance, which represents the larger publishers, is extremely enthusiastic about this, whereas the smaller outlets are more enthusiastic about the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. I think, however, that in the US, it's going to be very difficult to get support for journalism passed in Congress. I think that we were hopeful because of Biden that maybe something would move, but it's not clear that it's a top priority. I think there were attempts to get support for journalism into some of the stimulus and the bailout packages during COVID. So as usual, when you don't necessarily do something big, what do? You start a commission. So one of the ideas was to have a commission to study the problem, and that does actually look like it's going to happen. So we'll have a commission before we actually have more rules. Change in law. I always joke at Columbia that if a meeting is successful, it leads to another meeting. So I feel like this is a situation like that, the commission approach. Yes, so here we go. And there's lots of, like I said, it's a really exciting time. I think people that were skeptical of government funding before are now more enthusiastic. One person to watch is Steve Waldman, who's been coming up with all kinds of great ideas, including turning some of the media outlets into nonprofits. So there's lots of bubbling energy going on and debates really all over the world right now, including in the US. And here's some more. You'll have my PowerPoint so you can read more about it if you want to. And I've been writing a little bit for Columbia Journalism Review as well. In 2019, the federal budget in Canada announced nearly $600 million of support for Canadian news outlets. So there are now tax credits to help cover the cost of hiring journalists. And there are different, rules about what that means. So that's one of the things they're doing in Canada. Nonprofits can apply for charitable status. There are tax credits for digital news subscriptions. So the Canadians are really being quite creative about finding ways to support their news outlets. And at one of our Zooms, we had someone from the Canadian Heritage Agency, or I don't think it's a ministry, come and speak. And he said part of why Canada has so much experience supporting their media is because they always wanted to make sure it wasn't drowned out by the United States. So they became, it's a bit like France supporting their local outlets. So Canada has become quite adept at finding ways to support local news. And I mention all of this because it goes to the point that if you do want to help journalism, there are lots of ways to do it. And there is a role for the state and for government in supporting independent quality information and local news as well. So I don't think we should give up on that idea. So yes, so anyway, here's some more things that they're talking about just in the last couple of months. So amending the Copyright Act and also similar legislation to Australia as well. We've had some interesting meetings in South Africa where one of the proposals has been, again, to reduce the cost of accessing quality information. Harry Dugmore has been working on this quite a bit, along with other people. And both the Prime Minister's office and the Competition Authority are starting to have different discussions about supporting journalism and also about the ways of getting Google and Facebook to not necessarily support journalism, but at least to think about the competition implications of Google in Southern Africa. So what happened in Australia is making lots of different competition ministers and governments kind of look more closely at their regulation. As you know, Europe has been funding journalism for years. In Denmark, there's a belief that because it's such a small market, there won't be diversity or pluralism without support from government. And so nearly every form of media receives some sort of subsidy in Denmark. France as well gives a lot of subsidies to different news outlets. And they've had all kinds of very creative laws over the years, including for a long time, if you wanted to get permission to open a news kiosk on the street, you had to agree to stock something like 40 different newspapers and magazines. So there was a real commitment to the idea of pluralism. And there's certainly criticism that the French system supports things that wouldn't normally be profitable, and it stifles innovation. I'm not actually that worried about that. I don't think that's a terrible thing. I think it's unrealistic to expect quality news outlets to make a lot of money. And I think if government, I think it's important for government to support them. So I have no problem with this at all. Here's some other different ideas. So there's tax exemptions for outlets that offer a broad coverage of society. In Norway, they had direct media support for years. They set a floor for newspaper prices. Norway spends more on public service media per capita than anyone else in the world. I mean, they've got all that oil money, so they have funding to do that. And they've also been focused on trying to help media outlets. As you can see here, it's really one of the fundamental pillars of the welfare state in Norway. And then, of course, we get to all these questions. So I think what I've done is I've talked to you a little bit about new ideas and old ideas for supporting journalism. And supporting journalism and quality information is part of the fight against online mis and disinformation. So one aspect is controlling audience behavior. So teaching people about the difference between true and false, supporting media literacy efforts, fact-checking journalism ethics, that's one piece of it. But the other piece is the supply. How do you have a proper functioning marketplace of ideas? And one part of that is boosting the supply of quality information. But we all know that in today's world, there's already a lot of information. And there's so much information that the idea that there's a fully functioning marketplace doesn't really apply anymore. People like Zeynep Tufekci or Phil Napoli, Tim Wu will say to you, there's a drowning out effect because there's so much information. So a second part of the fight against online mis and disinformation is actually controlling the supply of it and trying to limit it. And how do you get the tech companies in a fair and transparent way to limit the supply of online mis and disinformation is a question that's, sort of paralyzed policymakers for years now. And one attempt was what Germany did in 2017 when they passed the NetzDG law, which actually made the tech platforms liable for persistent patterns of online mis and disinformation that they didn't take down. So actually, no, I'm sorry, not mis and disinformation, illegal information. So Germany has categories of banned speech. This is partly, many countries ban hate speech, but because Germany had a Nazi past, they have some very clear rules about what's allowed and what's not allowed. For example, you can't show a swastika right. So what this law did was it moved the liability from the individual posting illegal speech over to platforms that had a pattern. And if they were warned and didn't take it down, then they could be fined. So this is quite a serious law. In the US, there has been discussion about modifying Section 230, which protects the tech companies from liability. We have not passed such a law in the United States, but in Germany, they went ahead and did it. So there are obviously, mixed views about this. Some people have said I think the fear was that it would really chill free speech and that Facebook and Google would get so nervous, they would just take everything down. But the law got passed and they, went ahead and where they had to fine the companies. And then they've been modifying it very slightly, as you can see here, in 2021 to bolster the privacy and to safeguard the personal rights to data protection. So that's what's happened in Germany. It was pretty, it was a big deal when it happened. I don't think that, the sky has fallen in the way that people feared. And it's spread a little bit, but not as much as some would, might have expected. So I think one thing that really worried everybody about the NetzDG law was that countries that censor speech generally would copy it. And I have to admit, I was a little less worried about that because what I always said was, Vietnam and China and all these places have been censoring journalists for decades. And we can't stop. If European countries need to pass laws, they should be able to do that and not worry that they may be misused by other countries. So I've been, less worried about that, but certainly plenty of other countries have said, okay, now we're going to copy what Germany has done. And I've got a little list here for you. Some of these are not, many of these are not sort of very open free societies and do not respect freedom of press very much. Others, obviously France and Australia, are different. So I think it's pretty clear that this is not going to happen in the US. We are not going to be copying this. And in 2020, the EU announced the forthcoming Digital Services Act, and they released a draft of that in December. And that does set limits to what on content removal, and it allows users to challenge censorship decisions. So the EU is starting to look at, I think the consensus in Europe was they're not going to do what the Germans have done. That was pretty extreme. But the Digital Services Act, which is the major piece of EU legislation on this, it does address some of these same points. And then I've got some slides on the cons to legal remedies. I don't want to go on too long because I know we should have time for questions, but I will say that Peter Cunliffe-Jones has a paper that just came out actually this week, and an article that I highly recommend where he looks at the European laws and the effect that they're having in Africa. And he's very worried that some of these attempts are being exported around to Africa. And he looks particularly at the Digital Services Act and the language that's being used. I think that freedom of expression advocates are really worried that some of the new laws and the new discussion are getting very broad, that instead of saying, okay, the tech companies are liable for speech that's illegal, there's a lot of discussion about harmful speech. And how do you actually know what is harmful speech? There's no real definitions anywhere of harmful speech. And how can you legislate for that? So I think the main point, without getting too much in the weeds, is that we're learning this stuff is very hard to regulate. Technology is changing all the time. And it's really difficult to come up with sort of very clear rubrics or definitions that will apply in every situation. How do you know the difference between misinformation, disinformation, a harmful speech, incitement, dangerous speech? What do all those things mean? And how can you start legislating against them without really, really dampening freedom of expression? So I think the complexity of all of this has really paralyzed regulators. I think the good news is that in the years that we've been looking at all of these problems in the last 5-6 years, lots of good ideas have come up, and there is lots more that can be done. And what's really, I think, lacking is political will in many cases. So I think there are things that can be done, but people have been reluctant or slow. And the US, of course, much, much slower than Europe and the UK. So in December 2020 as well, the UK started putting out their proposed regulation, which builds on this report from 2017, 2019. And they're arguing that the platforms have a duty of care. They have liability. There can be fines for them, codes for political advertising, which is a whole other subject, mandated disclosure, professional code of ethics. So there's a lot of things that the UK is also pushing. Remember, they've left the EU, so they're going their own way in terms of regulation, not the EU. So I think maybe I'll stop here. As you can tell from my slides, I have a lot of different ideas that about what can be done. And there are many different proposals going all around the world. And I think the trick will be to make sure that future regulation doesn't encroach too much on free speech. So that will be one part of the sort of regulatory challenge. And then the other part will be finding policies that will help to support journalism as well, because we need that quality information and that local news. I think that the sort of the real conclusion to all of this is that the problems of dealing with mis and disinformation, the power of tech companies, and supporting journalism are all very urgent, but there isn't going to be one perfect solution around the world. Different countries are doing different things. The different tech companies are doing different things, and balancing freedom of expression with targeting mis and disinformation is going to be very, very difficult. The other point is, I think we can do, some of this can be regulated, but a lot of it's up to society also. And what's happened right now is in places like the United States, obviously Brazil, Turkey, you have such polarization that regulation can't address that. So much as we hope that fixing the problems that face journalism, that regulating the tech companies will solve the sort of crisis of democracy that we're living in, it's pretty clear that regulation won't solve those problems. I'll just show for the end of my PowerPoint that I have a lot of stuff on what the tech companies have actually done. So I hope that's useful, and feel free to look at the PowerPoint if you want more details about this very quick overview that I've just provided. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Professor Schiffrin. Thank you very much for this talk. I think the task is as giant as the platforms to try to find a solution here and trying to figure out how to deal with. And I guess one of the main questions we have is emerging from your presentation is that if we have to still thinking of regulation as a national task, and you presented some of the cases based on national regulations, and you show us Germany how to moving forward from the EU, and on the other hand, the US is struggling to do that and to present new regulations, and also also the UK moving forward in another direction. So shall we still thinking about national regulations, or in front of transnational kind of? But I think that's one of the main questions I will present to you.
So, you know, it was so interesting because when we did our webinar at Columbia, we had with 5 competition ministers, the South African competition minister said, you know, we can't do this on our own. It really should be in the hands of the UN or an international body. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense, but it's going to take a while for that to happen, or it may never happen. So in the meantime, as you've seen, different countries are doing different things. But what I also think can happen, and is happening a little bit, is that, you know, in America, the California standards for car emissions, it became easier for the car companies to just follow the California standards because it was such a big market. So everybody benefited from California's rules. And what I see a little bit happening is that the EU regulations may become the standard. So for example, the EU had regulations on and code of conduct on things like disclosing political advertising and who was placing political ads, and the US didn't. So I think it was Twitter and Facebook, I think it was, started these ad archives, and then they rolled it out in the United States as well. So I think what may end up happening is that the EU regulations may, to some extent, become standards in the US, if not globally. For example, GDPR, right? The privacy regulations ended up spreading. Now, obviously, lots of people say this isn't a great thing, and you know, why should the EU decide? And But frankly, at this point, if it's a choice between no regulation and EU regulation, personally, I'm quite happy with EU regulation. So I'm not a lawyer. I take quite a pragmatic view of all of this. And since the US is paralyzed and the EU is, everyone in Europe says they're moving slowly, but they're moving faster than the United States is. So I think that's part of what will happen, is the EU regulation will become the regulation to some extent, yeah. But I think the tech companies will keep fighting the regulation as much as they can, of course. And I think, you know, a whole other thing we haven't talked about is the incredible article, I guess it was yesterday, from ProPublica, about all the people that, you know, are avoiding taxes. Do you know what I'm talking about, right? And it's legal, right? It's through this capital gains law, but many of those billionaires are all the tech people, like Jeff Bezos, because they have made so much money from their monopoly power. So that's a whole other kind of regulation that needs to happen, which is making sure these people pay properly, and not the shockingly low rates that ProPublica calculated. I think they're paying like 0.98%, not even 1% of taxes. So that's a side point, but it's related because it speaks to the power of big tech. Anyway, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions in our chat, and I think they are related with the misuse of regulation, as you were talking about. And being in Latin America, I think is one of the most the concerns we have to think about these kinds of regulations. And on past decades, and in front of traditional media, where regulation, probably the best way to go was less regulation and less intervention of the state, but of course these are not traditional media. So, and one of the questions in the chat is from Eva Serrano, and it reads, if Trump had been reelected, will he still be blocked from Facebook or Twitter. And I think this is related with the power of politics and new media as well.
That's a really wonderful question. And we've been thinking so much about deplatforming over the last couple of weeks. And I was just on a Zoom yesterday where someone asked me, what do you think? And I said, oh, I'm so happy. I'm delighted that Trump has been kicked off the platforms. And then somebody in the audience, made the point, which is it's not about being delighted. It's about the standards, and there should be very clear rules about what's allowed and what's not allowed. So I have two things to say. One, whatever rules you want to design, Trump clearly broke them, right? It really doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. I mean, everything, threatening violence, incitement, lying, tampering with the democratic process, Trump broke all of them. So for that reason alone deserves to be deplatformed. And then the other point is you've got this strange situation where the people with the most influence and the most power have lower standards of behavior than everybody else. So if I did the things that Trump did on Facebook, I would be kicked off. But because he was the president, they kept saying, well, he's newsworthy. Therefore, he needs to have the microphone. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that this misuse by all these people suggests that we have to make them follow the same community standards that everybody else has to follow. It's not logical that because you're the most powerful, you get to say whatever you want. Now, there's definitely a debate about whether deplatforming works. The New York Times had an article this week looking at Trump's statements since he was kicked off, and they found they're spreading just as much as when he was there because his followers are retweeting and forwarding them. However, I think that the problem, that's not surprising because Trump, of course, is so powerful and so influential. But part of the idea of deplatforming is making sure we don't get the next Trump, right? That the amplification allows people to become more famous and spread their ideas and have more influence. And I thought Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, was absolutely right when he said a few years ago, everyone has the right to express themselves, but they don't have the right to virality. And I think that's right. So I think you're right. Under the questioner is right. Under the current rules, if he were president, he would still be allowed. But I think that's problematic because we're giving, and to all these conservatives in America that say, well, there's no evidence that incitement causes violence. Radio Rwanda, right? That spent weeks telling everyone, go kill the Tutsis. So I do think words are powerful, and I do think that they can have an effect, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's the worry we have from this side of the screen. Then it's another following up question about authoritarian countries and how they are going to use this kind of regulations. But you explained it during your presentation, and you show us some countries that are trying to do these kind of regulations that are not necessarily in our brightest light of democracy. But I don't know, what do you think about where its president threatened to remove Twitter from the country in Nigeria, for example? Will they adopt the EU regulation in these kind of countries, authoritarian countries? This is a question from Eva Serrano as well.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that Nigeria has now backpedaled and said that they will allow Twitter. But I think you're right. I mean, it's a mess out there, right? So if it's Myanmar, we say, you know what, Facebook is better than what the Burmese government is doing, right? Using WhatsApp and going ahead, or India under Modi, and inciting violence and encouraging people to go out and kill Muslims. Would I rather have Facebook making decisions in Myanmar than the Myanmar, government? Yes, I would. If it's Brussels, would I rather have Facebook or would I rather have the EU? I'd rather have the EU. So I think this is sort of the result of what you get when you have this lack of regulation, total fragmentation, and these very, very powerful platforms. But I don't think that splitting them up would necessarily help. I mean, I think if we had local control of Facebook in different countries around the world, then we'd probably have even more abuse than we have now. And more use. I mean, and to be clear, when I say abuse, I'm talking about using these platforms to spread violent speech, to encourage people to go kill ethnic minorities, to spread lies about elections, conspiracy theories, medical disinformation, anti-vax. This is the kind of abuse that I think is the problem, right? And this is what is obviously so hard to control.
I'm aware of the time, and I just want to thank you for your presentation, and just ask you in your presentation if you see Latin America, how is the region going in this efforts of regulation, and just to close up our talk and focus on Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that obviously you know far more about media in Latin America than I do, but clearly Latin America, there's a lot of things going on, right? So traditionally you had a lot of capture, you had a lot of sort of elite families owning outlets. And then a period of really repression by a number of governments. So, and at the same time, a really inspiring wave of investigative journalism and of independent voices. So I see a lot of different trends, both discouraging and encouraging. I was just on the phone today with someone in Colombia, and we were talking about the problem of media trust and how in many places the media has really become identified with elites and therefore has become mistrusted by regular people. And I think this is obviously a very difficult problem. We've seen leaders from Bolsonaro to Korea attacking the media as well, undermining it. And so I think that this lack of trust is also a huge problem that journalists in Latin America are facing, along with questions of dis and misinformation and and business model problems. So I think you've got a lot of the same problems that everybody else has too. And I hope that another time soon, you'll be able to tell me what some of the solutions are and how people are thinking about that, because I would really love to learn about what you're working on these days. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Of course, we're still working on this capture you mentioned in your book and how to deal with these issues, and we'll keep in touch.
Great, I love that. Thank you very much. See you
Thank
soon.
you so much. Thank you everyone for this, for joining us. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos en esta tercera cápsula de los 25 años de la Cátedra UNESCO en Comunicación y Sociedad en la Universidad Iberoamericana. Agradecemos mucho a todos su presencia, también a la profesora Anya Schiffrin y a todos los miembros del Departamento de Comunicación de la Universidad Iberoamericana. Agradecer este evento. Muchísimas gracias.